measurement process are 7 categories of safety-related behaviors called BASICs, which stands for Behavior, Analysis, and Safety Improvement Categories. The 7 BASICs address unsafe driving, which includes violations such as following too close, speeding, and careless or reckless operation. Hours of service compliance, which includes hours of service violations, as well as operating while ill or fatigued. Driver fitness, which you can think of as the driver qualification basic. It includes violations such as not having the correct license or endorsements, or not having a current medical card. Controlled substances and alcohol. This one should be self-explanatory. Vehicle maintenance, which includes violations of non-hazmat cargo securement regulations and violations of equipment inspection and maintenance regulations. Next is hazardous materials compliance, which includes regulations related to appropriate handling, securing, and documentation of hazardous materials. And finally, a crash indicator basic that documents and tracks DOT recordable crashes for both drivers and carriers. Those are the 7 basics, and knowing what they are, how they're scored, and what those scores can mean to you and your carrier is what the rest of this program is about. Even if you don't remember all the details, this knowledge can help keep you and your carrier out of trouble with the FMCSA. Before we go on to discuss each of the basics in some detail, you need some crucial background information, starting with how data is collected, measured, and evaluated within the Safety Measurement System, the SMS. Where do the violations used by the FMCSA come from? Roadside inspection reports. These reports are the major data source used in the CSA program. When you realize that there are over 3.5 million roadside inspections every year, you can understand that this is a rich source of data for the FMCSA. Every roadside inspection conducted by an FMCSA trained officer will have an impact on your CSA score. This can be an inspection that takes place at a weigh station, one that occurs as a result of a moving violation, or one that's part of a crash investigation. These inspections include both driver inspections and vehicle inspections. For example, hours of service compliance and controlled substances and alcohol violations are types of violations that appear on a driver inspection. Vehicle maintenance violations, such as lights not functioning, are types of violations that appear on a vehicle inspection. All of these are examples of violations which are scored against both the driver and the carrier. But certain technical violations are scored against the carrier only. As soon as an inspection is complete, the officer will submit the report to his or her state motor carrier safety office, and the state office will upload the report into the FMCSA database. Once the report is uploaded, it will be assigned to the correct carrier and driver. If no violations are listed, the process ends. Both the carrier and driver are credited with a violation-free inspection, which of course is a good thing. If there are violations listed, they will be assigned to one of the 7 basics. For example, if the violation noted relates to a malfunctioning turn signal, it will be assigned to the vehicle maintenance basic. Now here's a key concept. Each violation is assigned a value, which is based on the seriousness of the violation. This is called severity weighting. How is severity determined? Well, in a comprehensive study, the American Transportation Research Institute, or ATRI, along with law enforcement officials and the FMCSA's own experts, have demonstrated that risky driving behaviors are good predictors of the future risk that a driver will be involved in a crash. For example, in their initial study, ATRI found that drivers with a reckless driving violation showed a 325% increase in the likelihood of being involved in a crash. So, in the SMS, reckless driving violations are given a high severity weight. Violations that are less related to crash causation, such as obscured placard, for instance, are given a low severity weight. After severity weighting, the violation is also subject to time weighting. This is a way of putting more emphasis on recent violations than on past violations. These two data points, severity weighting and time weighting, are combined in the CSA program's Safety Measurement System, the SMS, to determine the full violation value within each basic. Again, some violations are scored against both the driver and the carrier. Some violations are scored against the carrier only. There are also some additional statistical tools applied to develop the final scores for each basic, for both the driver and the carrier. But the critical thing for you to know is that your scores are influenced by how many violations you have, how closely those violations are correlated to crash causation, and how recently they occurred. As a simple example, a violation for a damaged tie-down device that occurred 3 years ago would have a much lower impact on your score than a violation for reckless driving that occurred during the current year. These violations are combined, compared to other drivers and carriers, and assigned rankings as part of the safety measurement process. We'll say more about that later. With this background, let's look at each of the 7 basics in more detail. It's important to know that the unsafe driving basic is one of the standalone basics that are part of CSA. The standalone designation is given to the basics that the FMCSA considers most associated with crash causation. The unsafe driving basic includes moving violations like speeding, following too close, failure to stop at a railroad crossing, and other driver violations. As you're no doubt aware, these types of violations often trigger roadside inspections, so steering clear of moving violations is a key strategy for minimizing roadside inspections. If one of these violations is noted on a roadside inspection report by a trained officer conducted during a relevant inspection, the violation will be entered into the carrier's unsafe driving basic of the SMS. If the FMCSA has determined that the driver could have avoided, prevented, or stopped the violation, the driver is considered the responsible party, and the violation is entered into the driver's data as well as the carrier's data in the SMS. Now, by the way, here's a key point to remember. If the driver receives a warning, citation, or a ticket that's issued by an officer who has not entered it on a roadside inspection report, there's no entry into the SMS. Only data on roadside inspection reports submitted by trained officers becomes part of the CSA database. When a serious unsafe driving violation is reported to the FMCSA, it's assigned a severity weight of 10, and for the following 12 months, a time weight of 3. Multiplying these numbers yields a full value of 30, one of the highest full values in the system. After 12 months, the time weight drops down to 2, so the full value of this violation drops to 10 times 2, or 20. Clearly, avoiding violations for extended periods of time can have a significant impact on reducing your basic score and your carrier's basic score. And low scores in all the basics, especially the standalone basics, should be your goal. The best approach to ensure a low score in this basic is to avoid driving violations, especially high-severity violations. Practice defensive driving. Keep yourself fresh and alert to prevent poor driving decisions. And take advantage of any training programs your carrier offers. For your carrier, the actions are similar, providing effective training programs, mentoring by experienced drivers, and doing meaningful road tests are all techniques that can help develop safe driving behaviors. If the carrier identifies a driver who's not operating safely and in compliance, the carrier should have a system in place to correct that driver's behavior, even if no violations have been recorded in the SMS. Immediate, meaningful, consistent training for drivers who struggle with compliance is critical to keeping scores low. Having such a system in place can be helpful if the carrier is subjected to an FMCSA intervention. And remember, if you do receive a violation that's placed in the Unsafe Driving Basic, its value will diminish over time, dropping after 12 months and after 24 months. The violation will be eliminated from your data in the SMS after 36 months. So, even if you do make one mistake, you can improve your Unsafe Driving Basic score each year by avoiding subsequent violations. The other standalone basic is Hours of Service Compliance. It's standalone because the FMCSA has determined that driving while fatigued is directly related to crash causation, and I bet your own experience supports this determination. Here are some examples of high-severity weight violations placed in the Hours of Service Compliance Basic: operating when ill or fatigued, and operating in violation of an out-of-service order related to hours of service. Other violations that fall under the Hours of Service Compliance Basic include operating over hours or with a false log, log not current, no log when required, and failure to retain logs for 7 days. Even though these violations aren't assigned the maximum severity weight, having a number of violations with lower severity weight can add up to major problems for drivers and carriers. One additional note: Hours of Service Compliance is one of the basics that has an out-of-service penalty, or kicker. Anytime a driver is ordered out of service for a violation that's placed in this basic, the violation severity is increased by 2. So if the violation originally had a severity weight of 7, and the driver was placed out of service, the severity weight for the violation is increased to 9. Understanding how and when to complete a record of duty status, or driver log, is one of the key elements of the Hours of Service Compliance Basic. You can avoid violations by thoroughly understanding the Hours of Service regulations, by keeping your logbook with you, and by keeping it accurate, truthful, and up to date. And of course, don't drive if you're ill or fatigued, out of hours, or if you've received an out-of-service order. Also bear in mind that the number of time-weighted driver inspections the carrier and driver have undergone is used in scoring the Hours of Service Compliance Basic. For this reason, it's beneficial to accumulate good driver inspections, that is, inspections with no violations. These will help lower the driver's and the carrier's basic score faster than just waiting for the time-waiting process to diminish the basic score. Since the Hours of Service Compliance Basic relates closely to logging violations, carriers should offer comprehensive initial training on the Hours of Service regulations and establish and maintain a culture where violations are not tolerated. An effective tracking system to identify driver and supervisor compliance is key to maintaining a low Hours of Service Compliance Basic score. When problems are identified, carriers should offer immediate retraining to ensure that drivers and supervisors understand both the importance of compliance and the application of the rules. When logs are current and truthful, and drivers work within the Hours of Service regulations, their roadside inspections will report no violations for this basic. And because all driver inspections are factored into the scoring of this basic, these drivers and the carriers that employ them will benefit from low basic scores in the Hours of Service Compliance Basic. Contrary to what you might assume about the name of this basic, driver fitness does not refer to the physical fitness of drivers. It might be more appropriately called the Driver Qualifications Basic. The Driver Fitness Basic uses violations noted in roadside inspections that are associated with driver training, driver qualifications, and driver licensing, as related to the types of vehicles drivers operate and the loads they transport. And like all basics, Driver violations placed in the Driver Fitness Basic are uncovered in roadside inspection reports and can affect the scores of both drivers and carriers. Some examples of violations that fall under the Driver Fitness Basic include operating without the correct license or endorsements, or operating while holding multiple licenses, and operating without a valid medical card in possession, or having an expired medical certification. Like violations that are placed in other basics, driver fitness violations are assigned a severity weight and a time weight, and if applicable, a 2-point out-of-service penalty. Since driver qualifications and training are key elements of this basic, you can ensure a low score by being properly licensed and trained, and by keeping your training current. If your job involves transporting hazardous materials, be sure you've received the training you need to be qualified to carry these loads. You should always have a valid license of the correct class with the necessary endorsements for the type of truck and type of loads you're transporting. Carriers also have a role in keeping scores for the Driver Fitness Basic low. You know all those annoying reminders and forms you get from your company? That's an effort which will keep you and the company out of trouble in this basic. Verifying each driver's training, offering refresher training, and verifying licenses and endorsements in a driver qualifications file will help keep unqualified drivers off the road. A best practice in this area is not to dispatch any driver until all qualification requirements are met, even the ones that allow 30 days for completion. If drivers or carriers have violations placed in the Driver Fitness Basic, remember the time weighting process will diminish the value of violations over time. This basic also uses time-weighted driver inspections as a normalizing factor, so achieving more good driver inspections, that is, inspections with no driver violations, is the fastest way to reduce your basic measure in the Driver Fitness Basic. And every driver should be able to pass the physical exam and have a current medical card in his or her possession at all times. Understanding this basic is pretty easy. If you know the controlled substances and alcohol regulations found in parts 382 and 392 of the FMCSA regulations, you know what the violations are. Like other basics, this has nothing to do with receiving a citation or ticket for operating under the influence while driving your personal car. Citations and tickets are a different matter and are of course serious, but they're not tracked in the SMS. For a controlled substance or alcohol violation to become part of the SMS, recorded under this basic, it must be noted by a trained officer in a roadside inspection report or during a carrier investigation. Examples of violations placed in the Controlled Substances and Alcohol Basic include operating under the influence, possession of drugs or alcohol in a commercial motor vehicle, and consumption of alcohol within 4 hours of coming on duty. The highest severity weight is attached to the violations with the closest correlation to crash causation. So, violating an alcohol or drug-related out-of-service order and using or possessing a drug while operating a CMV both have maximum severity weights. Just like the other basics, driver and carrier violations are valued using the severity and time weighting process, and then compared to their peers within safety event groups to create basic scores. For drivers, staying on the good side of this basic is pretty simple. Don't operate a vehicle under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Illegal, prescription, or even misuse of over-the-counter medication that can affect driving abilities. For carriers, achieving a low score in this basic requires several actions, all designed to create a culture where drinking alcohol and doing drugs on the job is never tolerated. This means establishing effective policies and providing the training drivers need to understand the policies, and it means enforcing those policies rigorously. To avoid on-the-road problems in this area, your carrier may choose to establish and enforce policies that are stricter than the regulations mandate. For example, requiring a driver to be alcohol-free for 12 or 24 hours before coming on duty, rather than the regulations required 4 hours. Carriers do this so that if there's an investigation, having such a policy sends a clear signal to the FMCSA that the carrier is serious about the controlled substances and alcohol basic. Proper vehicle maintenance is paramount to safety, and some vehicle maintenance issues have considerable bearing on crash causation. This means that severity weights can be high for certain vehicle maintenance violations. Vehicle maintenance violations are also subject to an additional 2-point penalty for an out-of-service order. If an out-of-service order is issued because of a vehicle violation, the severity weight of the violation is increased by 2. Examples of violations that fall under the Vehicle Maintenance Basic include defective brakes and lights, failure to make required repairs, failure to perform annual and periodic inspections, or failure to prepare inspection reports, and operating an out-of-service vehicle. This basic also contains non-hazmat cargo securement violations. Examples include no equivalent means of securement, no edge protection for tie-downs, and insufficient aggregate working load limit. Under the Vehicle Maintenance Basic, severity weights, time weights, and statistical formulas are applied, and peer group comparisons are used among drivers and carriers to determine scores and potential interventions. The obvious answer for drivers is to make sure that you complete all required vehicle inspections, cargo checks, and report problems to your carrier immediately so they can be addressed. By actively resolving vehicle issues, you increase the likelihood that you'll have violation-free roadside vehicle inspections, which will help lower scores in the Vehicle Maintenance Basic. Inspections should include a pre-trip inspection at the beginning of the day, a walk-around inspection anytime the vehicle is parked, and a post-trip inspection, including completion of a driver vehicle inspection report, or DVIR, at the end of the day. Your carrier should also have plans in place to handle on-road repairs. As a driver, you should know these procedures and who to contact when on-road maintenance or repairs are required. Inspections and repairs should be well documented. That way, if your carrier is investigated, they have the documents to back up your inspection procedures. Many of the violations placed in the Vehicle Maintenance Basic are the shared responsibility of the driver and the carrier. However, some are considered the sole responsibility of the carrier. Whether maintenance is handled in-house or by a contractor, your carrier should have a system of scheduling maintenance and using maintenance checklists that monitor and document all maintenance activities. These documents can also be very useful if the carrier is investigated by the FMCSA for having a high percentile ranking or basic score in the Vehicle Maintenance Basic. Such a system is also useful in resolving ongoing problems with specific pieces of equipment and identifying drivers for whom maintenance issues appear to be a chronic problem. As for the cargo securement portion of the Vehicle Maintenance Basic, the most obvious cargo issues relate to flatbeds, but dry van and refrigerated van drivers must also be vigilant in following cargo loading and securement procedures in order to achieve a low basic score. Failure to use appropriate straps, dunnage, or load bars on loads that do not reach the back doors of the van can result in a failure to secure violation. When carriers and drivers specialize in transporting cargo with specific securement requirements, such as steel or concrete pipe, Those carriers should go the extra mile to ensure that all drivers are trained. This will help both drivers and carriers achieve low scores in the Vehicle Maintenance Basic. One of your key responsibilities as a driver is to make sure that any hazardous materials you transport have been properly packaged, labeled, and documented before they're loaded onto your vehicle. You also need to make sure that hazardous materials are properly secured and that hazmat paperwork is where it should be, in the cab. The Hazardous Materials Compliance Basic encompasses the safe transportation of hazardous materials. Many of the technical violations placed in this basic relate to marking, certifying, and documenting hazardous material. These responsibilities tend to fall on the carrier or shipper. However, a significant number of hazardous material violations are assigned to the driver as well, and are therefore used to determine the driver's measure under this basic. Examples of hazardous materials violations for which the driver is responsible include failure to comply with requirements for handling hazardous materials, vehicle not placarded as required, and placards obscured. These violations carry lower severity weights because they are safety violations, but not ones that are likely to cause a crash. Examples of high-value violations include intermediate bulk container requirements and release of hazmat from package. Remember the out-of-service penalty or kicker? It applies in this basic too. If the vehicle is placed out of service as the result of a violation of these or other cargo regulations, the severity weight is increased by 2. The full value of the violations placed in the Hazardous Materials Compliance Basic is calculated like it is for other basics. The severity weight for each violation is multiplied by the time weight for each, and then once a month, the full values are totaled in the SMS. The surest path to preventing violations placed in the Hazardous Materials Compliance Basic is knowledge. Knowledge gained by understanding the regulations related to transporting hazardous materials, and knowledge gained by inspecting your load and taking action when you identify a problem. Examples might include improper or obscured placards and load documentation problems. With any of these violations, you can easily find yourself with an elevated Hazardous Materials Compliance Basic score. At its core, CSA is designed to prevent crashes, so it's not surprising that monitoring crash events is a critical part of the SMS. Unlike the other 6 basics, which each relate to a specific category of behavior, the Crash Indicator, or Crash Basic, collects data on one of the more extreme consequences of unsafe driving behaviors. The Crash Basic uses state-generated crash reports to add data points to both the carrier's and the driver's SMS record. It's important to note that under the current system, all crashes are recorded. It doesn't matter who was at fault. If you're involved in a crash while operating a CMV, even as a victim, that crash will become part of the SMS database. However, crashes used for this measure include only recordable crashes, those that result in a fatality, an injury requiring immediate treatment away from the scene, or requiring vehicles to be towed from the scene due to disabling damage. As with the other basics, the Crash Basic uses severity weighting. The assigned weights are 1 for a towaway crash with no injuries or fatalities, 2 for crashes with injuries or fatalities, or for towaway crashes with a hazardous materials release, and 3 for injury or fatality with a hazmat release. Time weighting for the Crash Basic works the same as the other basics. 3 within the last 12 months, 2 within 12 to 24 months, and 1 within 24 to 36 months. For carriers, the time waiting is slightly different. If you're crash-free for 36 months, the Crash Basic will not have any crashes to be valued, and you'll not even be scored in this basic. And, as with all the other basics, once each month, drivers' crash values are totaled by the SMS to determine the measure in the Crash Basic. Again, statistical tools are applied to those who have been involved in crashes to determine the driver's and the carrier's scores in the Crash Basic. And one last thing to note, there are no driver peer groups for the Crash Basic. There are, however, safety event groups for carriers. Your goal in all basics is to have a low percentile ranking, or basic score. In the Crash Basic, achieving a low score is easy. Don't be involved in a crash. This means more than just not causing crashes. You need to drive defensively, operate within the traffic rules and regulations, and anticipate the actions of other drivers on the road to prevent your involvement in a crash. And it means training. Upgrading and refreshing your skills on a regular basis is an effective way to avoid involvement in a crash. For carriers, as well as drivers, the key is to work toward preventing crashes. First, carriers need to make sure all drivers receive complete and current training in defensive driving, and that all drivers understand that consistently practicing defensive driving is an expected part of job performance. Monitoring driver compliance using logbooks, onboard data collection, and on-road observation can help ensure that drivers understand and are meeting carrier expectations. Furthermore, carriers should investigate all crashes, not just DOT recordable crashes. These investigations can be instrumental in uncovering causal factors and root causes. The results of these investigations should be used to guide a systematic approach to preventing future crashes. We've described the 7 basics. We've talked about the kinds of violations that fall under each basic, and we've given you a general overview of the scoring process. Now we'll talk a bit more about scoring, and then we'll discuss how these basic scores work within the rest of the compliance safety accountability system for both drivers and carriers. Since most violations start with a roadside inspection report, we'll begin with drivers. You should know that your basic measures and scores are confidential, and if you feel a violation was wrong, was assigned to you in error, or is otherwise incorrect, there is an appeal process you can pursue. You'll find information about how to appeal a violation at the FMCSA website. While there are some differences among the basics in determining scores, all begin by gathering the violations. This refers to the fact that each month, all the violations in each basic are recorded for every driver. If a driver has a roadside inspection with no violations, that too is factored into the scoring process. Next, the severity weights of the various violations are assigned, with the highest severity weights given to violations that have demonstrated the greatest correlation with crash causation. And as we mentioned, for some basics, specifically hours of service compliance, driver fitness, vehicle maintenance, and hazardous materials compliance, an out-of-service penalty of 2 points is added to the severity weight if the roadside inspection results in an out-of-service order. We also mentioned time weights, which give more importance to recent violations than those that occurred in the more distant past. If the violation occurred within the previous 12 months, the driver's time weight is 3. Within 12 to 24 months, the time weight is 2. And within 24 to 36 months, the time weight is 1. Using this method, the value of each violation diminishes over time and is eliminated after 36 months. Multiplying the severity weight by the time weight gives a result called the full value of the violation. When the full value of all violations in certain basics are added together, and the FMCSA applies statistical tools, the result is a number that can be used for a fair comparison among carriers and drivers. The number created in this process is called the basic measure. I should emphasize that the basic measure is not the score. To reach the score, drivers and carriers' basic measures are compared to similar drivers and carriers. For carriers, the comparison process starts by dividing carriers into safety event groups, or peer groups, based on the number of violations, inspections, or crashes the carrier has had in the last 2 years. The driver process is similar in most basics, except that in the unsafe driving and crash basics, drivers are all in one large peer group. Within these groups, the drivers and carriers are percentile ranked, and it's this percentile rank that is the basic score. The carrier or driver with the best measure receives a percentile rank of 0, while the carrier or driver with the worst measure receives a percentile rank of 100. If the carrier's percentile rank or score is above a predetermined threshold, the FMCSA initiates an enforcement action against the carrier. When a carrier's score for one or more of the 7 basics exceeds the threshold that the FMCSA has established for intervention, the carrier involved may be subject to a variety of actions designed to address specific and documented safety issues. Before CSA, the worst performing carriers were subject to a comprehensive, time-consuming on-site audit, and drivers were only indirectly part of the process. Under CSA, the FMCSA has a range of intervention tools that can be applied to carriers. Carrier interventions can be triggered by exceeding the threshold scores in one or more basics, demonstrating a high crash rate, involvement in a fatal crash, or receiving a complaint. The interventions that are applied to carriers are designed to be progressive, increasing in severity as more serious safety issues are identified. The FMCSA organizes interventions into 3 categories: early contact, investigations, and follow-on. Early contact interventions include warning letters and targeted roadside inspections. Investigations include off-site, focused on-site, and comprehensive on-site. Follow-on interventions include cooperative safety plans, notices of violation, notices of claim, settlement agreements, and the ultimate intervention, unfit suspension, placing the motor carrier out of business. The specifics of imposing an unfit suspension are subject to a rulemaking process and will be spelled out in a future regulation. The types of interventions chosen are at the discretion of the FMCSA investigator and are based on the carrier's basic scores and enforcement history. Even though most interventions will be used to promote safety improvements by carriers, drivers play a key role in seeing that their employer is not targeted for enforcement. In fact, drivers can also be the subject of interventions when their carriers are examined. While the FMCSA is investigating the carrier, all of the carrier's driver CSA scores are checked, and this is when individual drivers may end up warned or fined. 2 more notes on the scoring system. First, your basic scores do not affect your CDL and are not related to the point systems that many states use when drivers receive tickets within their state. Second, you cannot escape past violations or high basic scores by simply changing jobs. Even though violations are recorded for both carriers and drivers, changing carriers does not result in a fresh start with respect to your basic scores. Under CSA, scores follow you from job to job. Another thing you should be aware of: if you didn't get cited for a violation on the road, that doesn't mean you're off the hook. If your company undergoes an investigation and violations are found during the investigation, you may be fined, and your carrier may have their related basic evaluation changed to alert and possibly have their safety rating lowered. So, as an example, if an hours of service violation is found in your logs during a carrier investigation, that violation will become a data point in your company's compliance review and safety rating. If there are enough driver violations, the company may be given an alert status within that basic, and you may be fined for the violations discovered during your carrier's compliance review. This is another good reason to keep your hours of service records and other required records up to date, true, complete, and correct. Also, if your carrier is subject to an intervention due to a high basic score, the FMCSA will review all of the carrier's drivers looking for high scores. If the investigation confirms significant driver violations, the FMCSA can take action against drivers, such as a notice of violation or a notice of claim. These actions could result in significant fines for the identified drivers. The surest way to avoid these FMCSA actions is to generate low basic scores in all of the 7 basics by driving defensively, knowing the regulations, and continuing to upgrade your training. We've covered a lot of information on the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's CSA program, and you may feel a bit overwhelmed. So, let me give you 3 important takeaways from this video. 1. If you already know and consistently comply with the regulations, what we've talked about in this program will have very little impact on your day-to-day driving. 2. If your carrier offers the training and compliance checks we've discussed, it's unlikely that the FMCSA will impose an intervention that will result in enforcement actions against you. And 3. When it comes to your basic scores in the CSA program, you are literally in the driver's seat. By striving for roadside inspections that result in no violations, you can actively control your own and your carrier's scores. The FMCSA's Compliance Safety Accountability Program gives everyone in the industry, both carriers and drivers, the opportunity to have their performance compared to the performance of their peers and to improve their safety-related behaviors so we can all be safer on the road.